Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac. This is take two. The first one got scrubbed by the Department of Justice. We were talking about aggressive Bitcoin mining strategies.
Yeah.
Matt, take it away.
This thing is like in areas of the ocean that are like meant to stay cold, that's the coldest parts of the ocean for cooling Bitcoin computers. And so,
So it's like geothermal, but in the ocean.
but it's, yeah, kind of just doing the bad thing for like the marine sanctuaries.
Yeah, I mean, you're really just centralizing the damage. So it's
Yes.
not spread
Yeah,
out.
yeah. Centralizing it into ocean.
It's just in one spot. So that's good. Yes.
There's nothing wrong with a warm ocean.
I see nothing going bad here. Yes. No.
And that's how you make it in Bitcoin, by the way. Getting your cooling expenses really low. That's the most important.
It is. It's true. And then when you've got all that crypto, you can go sell MRE packets to homesteaders who are prepping for the end times, which Matt is accelerating.
Mhm.
So you're really creating your own market here. This is very cyclical.
That's what I'm saying. This is the part of the business that's kind of like a no-brainer.
Yeah. And while we're at it, we're going to diversify it because now we've created the conditions for specific economic factors, which most people are not aware of. So one thing that we can really get into is canning, which is actually what we're talking about today. And I'm really excited because everyone loves canning, or maybe, I don't know. I think so.
Speaking of disasters, have you tried this guy's pasta sauce? Jeez.
Hey, Luigi, calm down over there.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Canning, Andy.
Canning. I'll can it, all right?
Hit me if you can.
Okay, so let's talk about canning. Everyone knows what it is, right? It's this idea that we can make shelf-stable foods, and it's like a fairly cheap thing to do once you've got the basic equipment, right? You got the jars, you got the canning gear to like can the food. The only thing you really need to replace are lids or vinegar.
Just to be clear, these are canning in glass jars, not canning in like aluminum cans.
Correct. We're not going to get into tin canning here, although I think that does play into this history a little bit. But in terms of like how we think of it today, I guess that's what I'm kind of focusing on. So the concept of canning is pretty straightforward. Most people are familiar with it in some capacity. We're not going to talk about how to do it. We're going to talk about its context historically. We talked about this a bit in the blueberry episode. Canning really emerged in the 19th century. In the early 19th century specifically is where a lot of that tin canning came from. And then moving forward into the late 19th century, we saw it more the way we think of it today. And in that context, that's where homesteading began to understand or have canning as a part of like what it meant to homestead. Canning was driven largely by industry that was basically looking to find ways to stretch food sales beyond the harvesting season, because you could do a handful of things. You could dehydrate, you could pickle, which I guess would be a form of canning, but existed before, again, like tin canning existed. And you could use a handful of techniques to make food last longer. But usually speaking, it fundamentally changed like the way the food tasted. You weren't going to use a dehydrated carrot the same way you might use you're not going to chew on it like a fresh carrot or expect it to have the same like profile or utility unless you rehydrate it.
You never tried my carrot jerky?
I have not had your...
Andy, I brought you all that carrot jerky and you haven't tried a single piece?
I have not had any of the kirky, Matt.
It's teriyaki too.
Yeah, teriyaki. So this basically made it so that when you harvested food, you could stretch out when you sold it longer, to the point where you could buy things that were out of season and it was totally reasonable and fine. This was a win for farmers because they didn't have to worry so much about spoilage. And it was a win for producers that sold it because, again, they didn't have to worry about spoilage. And it also meant that they could control prices so that there wasn't this glut which pushed prices down and then really expensive food outside of that really short window, right? Canning was also really big on the West Coast for purposes of processing wild foods, fish, things like that. And actually was really important in a lot of union organizing out on the West Coast, which is a really interesting story. Sicilians doing their Sicilian thing. Go check that history out at some point if you're interested.
Sicilians be canning.
Sicilians be canning.
Is that that could be a sticker?
It could be.
Although maybe we'd have to make a more of an Italian pivot.
Yeah, Luigi cans.
Mm,
Sorry, Matt told me not to make any Luigi jokes today, and here we are.
and here we are.
3 minutes in.
Jesus Christ.
Here we are. This fucking guy. This fucking Guido.
You know, and I've always said that. I've always fucking said that.
I mean, I deserve it after what was I calling you the last episode we recorded?
Oh,
The Braggett.
yeah.
Yeah. We're trading shots here. So what we're going to talk about isn't canning in the process and like its historical relevance, but rather community canning centers, which is something that for many people they've never heard of before, which is really unfortunate because there's a really cool and interesting history that we're going to jump into today about this. I think it's something that we should be talking about, especially in the space that we occupy, about how could we retool some of these ideas to a modern context, which some organizations are doing. We're going to be talking about that next week. So the first community canning centers were often the result of like neighborhood organizing to save money and time and labor, because if you've done canning, it can be a really time consuming process, but it is also something that can be streamlined with the right resources and made much more efficient. These were often funded by organizations from towns and local governments, municipalities, commissioners, school boards, mill owners, even. So there were a number of people that are like, no, this is a good thing. This is good for our communities. And if we think about it like within the context of the late 19th, early 20th century, this was also a time when rural communities were dying. Something Liberty Hyde Bailey was talking about at this time. A lot of names that we've talked about in depth really tied stuff like community canning towards solutions for the collapse of rural communities, rural identity, and all this kinds of stuff. Not only was this about like recreating community in these rural spaces, but it also was to very functionally help supplement farm incomes through this period. As glass jars and tin cans became more affordable, it allowed people with small homestead plots or small farmers, like I said, to extend their selling season, can stuff for themselves so they didn't have to buy produce outside of the season. And it allowed for people to basically just be more resilient collectively without a significant cost associated with it. It was a way to, again, try to keep those communities resilient. By the late 1880s, there was already over 3,800 community canneries in the country, largely to help, again, people in communities produce surplus produce from their gardens and small farms.
Well, also, I just want to jump back to the point that you said right at the beginning of this, which was like, if you've done canning, there's like a huge difference between like doing just the cans you need for yourself and like doing, several hundred at a time in like in a place that has better, fitted equipment, more powerful stoves. It means that sort of efficiency, such a, I guess, scale of efficiency gain kind of underlies how important that not necessarily the like individual model everyone needs to like buy their equipment method of how to spread.
Yeah, and oddly enough, we kind of talked about this last time we were together because you had butchered like two roosters, and you're like, oh my God, between prep, breaking down, and butchering, and like from live rooster to thing in my fridge was like 2 hours a rooster, because there's so much of that time that whether it's 1 or 100 chickens, so, well, what in accounting we would call like fixed cost, that is associated, that when you start to scale significantly, it doesn't matter. But when you are doing small scale, it does. And that exists with canning too. So once you can scale up, a lot of those fixed cost and scalability issues that kind of become like these really big choke points with production, they kind of go out the window when you can do it at a community scale.
Yeah. And being able to work at this community scale also like does kind of say something about finding a sweet spot between those sort of like efficiency gains, the like quite rapid efficiency gains moving from like the individual to community level, and then the sort of like sacrifices of autonomy or community identity that comes with a more consolidated model, which I'm sure we'll touch on later in this episode.
We might. So, yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is what Marx called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall,
Hmm.
where basically those marginal efficiencies become smaller and smaller the higher you scale up, right? If you're at 90% efficiency, you only have 10% more efficiency to go up, right? And how much does it cost you to get that 10% efficiency increase, right? From 10,000 cans to a million cans or whatever it might be, right? And then that loss of autonomy for that small margin of increase is really important to understand. To contextualize that, like with what we're talking about, like these canning centers were also functionally community centers. So, for example, in 1915, the Texas Agricultural Extension Service, or TAEX, as I'll call them from here on out,
Takes.
takes,
Yeah.
they takes a lot. They introduced these community canning centers in the state of Texas, which were funded both by public and personal funding. And basically, how it worked was that white women organized fundraising and activities, while the white men were responsible for the construction, the fueling, and the functional operating of these centers.
The boy jobs, if you will.
Yeah, the boy jobs versus the girl jobs, as we were told in school, and we should never question that.
Amen, brother.
Can I get a hell yeah?
Hell yeah.
So these centers
I love fueling.
love good fueling.
Sorry.
They allowed small farmers to preserve, as we said, sell, increase income, and support these economically repressed areas, particularly for poor white farmers who relied on subsistence farming, unlike any other colored farmers.
Nope.
No, right? It's never happened. It's only white people. Now, for context, in 1915, only one community cannery existed for African Americans.
In the whole country?
Yes, in the whole country.
Well, thank goodness there weren't many African Americans.
Fortunately, they were so well off that they didn't need them.
Man, just one.
I'm sorry, everyone. That's terrible. Now, by 1918, the number had increased to 250 as canning became a very big tool during World War I for community resiliency. You know, we haven't talked about it, but the concept of victory gardens, I'm sure people are familiar with. They're more closely associated with World War II, but they were around for World War I as well. For African American families, preserving food was particularly valuable as most of the farming around them and that they did for paying their bills was cotton, which is a cash crop. And for African Americans, especially in the South, food prices were inflated, similar to like how we think of food deserts today here. They were even more exacerbated in the South and rural communities back in the early 20th century. So being able to have your own food and, more importantly, preserve it had significantly bigger impacts on African American communities in the South. And according to County Agent Robert Hines, nearly every African American farm family planted a home garden and preserved the majority of their harvest, whereas only a few years before the community canneries existed, practically no vegetables were saved and a very little fruit.
What, like a cherry? Or like just like a plum?
Singular cherry every year.
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
just a little fruit.
That's what inspired Yeats, the plum. What the fuck is that poem? Do you know what I'm talking
No, I was
about?
gonna say sick Yates reference.
Yeah, I'm gonna Google it real quick. Hold on.
Excuse us, listeners, while we take our Yates break that we take every episode.
It was William Carlos Williams, not Yeats. My bad. Do you know what I'm talking about now?
No. Is it about a
It's about plums, yes. It's I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold.
No.
That's your poetry for the day,
It's a pretty nice one.
isn't it? I'm just embarrassed that I thought it was Yeats.
Although
Sorry,
I
everyone.
would be kind of pissed if I went to
Self-flagellation.
the fridge in the morning and I found a poem instead of my fruit.
Yeah, it's not a trade. It's not an equal
That's
trade.
why you never marry a poet.
No. Okay, so
That's the sticker.
let's get back to the canning.
No, never marry a poet.
Never marry a
The
poet.
Poor Bros Almanac.
Yeah, we're here for everything. We got everything but the poets.
Yep.
All right, so community canning centers, they were not just these centers for producing food, which was significantly important, but they were also these really big community centers, right? They were places for education, demonstration, and training on preservation. But also, what was important about them is that they forced communities to build stronger relationships with people in their community, which I think a lot of people today would say, well, obviously that existed back then. Like, it's not like today where everyone's stuck on their phone. While that's true, there's also it was a little bit messier than it is today. People were affiliated with their churches. Churches talked shit about other churches because they wanted to get members from other churches because that meant more money came in, right? So community wasn't just about like who lives in your town. It was specifically who fits into this like specific part of your identity of what your denomination of Christianity was or what church was closest to you. So this became a way to kind of integrate communities that otherwise were kind of isolated into these little silos, right? A really interesting way that was described was in the USDA describing one of the Jacksonville canning centers, or several of them rather, describing them as really small community centers where church socials, parties, and community recreational activities are centered. They are equipped to function as emergency feeding centers and as Red Cross canteen centers in times of war. So, like, they clearly were identified by the government and funded by the government with this idea that they were much more community based than a church might be, where it can draw from these multiple facets and have this utilitarian use, which is like a really interesting way to think about how community organizes, right? That we don't have that today. And if somebody said, like, how are you going to organize, like, collectively for an emergency in your community, where would you go? It'd probably be like the public school. Like, that's what they do for like snow emergencies, tornadoes, and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting that, the focus was shifting from churches to this, like, I'd say it's like more municipally based.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
No?
So as the droughts through the Dust Bowl continued on, or what became the Dust Bowl continued on, a lot of work between state and private funding was put into this development of more community canning centers. This manifested in a number of ways, things like the bulletins that came out of TAEX, TAEX, which became more than just how to can. They became full descriptions of empty building or empty piece of land to finished canning center and how you would build it. And not only was it done to like say, all right, here's a piece of land, here's the finished product, this is how you get there. It was done with the understanding that people building it probably didn't have access to specialized tools, specialized cuts of lumber, specialized anything, and probably couldn't read really well. So they're written basically for people that were semi-literate, and it was basically like IKEA directions to build an entire like canning center, which is just amazing.
I'd love to buy a canning center from IKEA.
Right?
Can you imagine?
I want to know what that would be called.
Uh,
Canning Florton.
let me work on that.
Yeah. So once they were able to get these facilities funded, built, agents in the community would come and meet people to do canning demonstrations to be like, here's how you can your food. I'm going to train some of you, and you're going to be the people that I'm going to train the trainer kind of thing, right? Because of the diversity of challenges that came with like creating these centers, their locations, lack of power access, all this fun stuff, agents were really like thrown out in the field to figure it out. One example that was really interesting is some agents that actually did canning demonstrations on a creek bank because, in their words, water was available at the creeks but not at the home. So that's where they could teach people how to do it, which like speaks to the fact that this was just like a wild affair of trying to figure out how to get people the resources and tools they need to be successful, which is just like chaotic and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
With these plans, like I know I said it was like from blank piece of land to a finished building, they included things like drainage, sanitation, native shrubs to use in landscaping, native berries, things like that.
Wow.
So it was like a full scale operation. It was not just like here's how to can food and that is it. And it's just like really cool because our government doesn't do shit for us now, but like they actually had like a lot of really cool and interesting resources that could be like applied by like everyday people. And a lot of these people ended up taking this knowledge and then bringing it back to those other communal spaces. So like churches and schools where they would start to apply some of these concepts, where it's like, okay, here's things we can do smarter in this space to make it more functional, to make it more accessible, so on and so forth.
I mean, it also speaks to something that's like, I think we've talked about before on here, the idea of like an open versus a closed technology.
Yeah.
And like, this information is specifically geared toward making using this canning technology like as widely and as accessible as possible, like really, simple instruction, all this, you don't have to like plan the land, you don't have to do any of these things, rather than relying on, what we have today, which is like licensing. Well, I guess licensing or not. Like, not just anyone can do this now.
Yeah, no, and it's so capital intensive and largely inaccessible for most people. And like there are some reasons why that might be not a bad thing, but also like empowering people is important. And we're going to see that actually in the next example. So this allowed a lot of communities to try to self-govern their centers because the government was basically like, "Hey, we gave you the money, you built it, you've been trained on it. This is your baby now. Go have fun." So there was like a lot of autonomy that came with these centers, which was particularly important in a lot of Black communities in the South. So I talked about Texas, and that has its own really interesting story that we're going to get into. In 1929, Black families canned more than 1 million jars of food and averaged 115 cans of jars per family at an estimated value of about $370,000 or $6.85 million in 2024. Residents paid for access to the cannery with a percentage of their produce, which meant that they didn't have to come up with upfront capital, cash, or anything. It was just, I'm going to show up with my produce. If I'm going to can 100 cans of tomatoes, 10 of them are going to go to the facility that they can sell and pay for the operating costs. It doesn't cost me anything except the time it took me to pick them and grow them, which I can afford because I'm, resource rich, cash poor. So in this way, the canneries became self-sustaining after that initial investment, and they also became this source for the community to have some self-determination, some self or community pride and capacity for individual self-determination as well. So producing food wasn't just self-reliance for myself, but it also meant I was giving back to the community because it helped the canning facility exist for other people as well. And this improved the entire community while doing something for myself and my family. So as the Depression worsened into the 1930s, the momentum for these canning centers continued. 4 more African American canning centers opened in 1931, followed by 12 in 1932, and then 43 more in 1933. Like I said, I wanted to give an interesting example for African American communities in Texas. One was built in Beulah County in 1932. What made this interesting is the residents salvaged materials from an old hall destroyed by a storm and pulled 2 years' worth of winnings from a local county fruit display. So it was 100% funded by themselves. And, I did mention that there's a bunch of different organizations that were funding these. As FDR took presidency, the New Deal started rolling out. There's a lot of New Deal dollars that went towards filling the gap for a lot of these centers to make them happen. Now, in Texas, all but 3 of the canning centers were owned by communities and cooperatives, with only 3 that were privately owned, which is just like astronomical when you think of like public versus private ownership here in the United States today.
Yeah, truly. That's it's pretty nice ratio.
Yeah, the way it should be. Now, canning centers, again, going back to what we were talking about with Liberty Hyde Bailey, they really helped build that community identity, which was particularly, again, important in a lot of African American communities and helped to build a lot of racial solidarity. Unlike the competing churches that I'd mentioned before, canneries required residents to cooperate collectively, not just to like get them built, but then as you knew people that were interested in canning, ordering bulk seeds, negotiating planting schedules and harvesting times in order to make sure if everyone's growing tomatoes, we're not all trying to go into the cannery the same week, right? Like some of us should grow early growing, mid-season, late season, so on. So that way there's some timing of, well, we know the canning center can only produce this much at a time. So let's work collectively to time what we're buying, when we're harvesting, so that the center can consistently process everything and nobody's kind of feeling left out in the cold or, whatever.
What do you mean? They didn't just sell the slots to the highest bidder?
I know. It's like they didn't know what country they were in.
It's like they were planning the economic actions collectively. That's insane.
And it was a benefit for everyone. Crazy, right?
It's not what the It's not. It's not how you're supposed to
It's not in the
play.
Declaration of Independence.
I don't know, man.
So yeah, these were really important centers for building community, building resiliency, and forcing people to interact with people they otherwise wouldn't have done so with, right? And even though I've talked a lot about the fact that these were largely racially defined, there were interracial canning centers, which again forced communities to integrate in ways that otherwise probably wouldn't have happened, especially since canning centers were overwhelmingly in the southeastern United States, where they could use a little, you know, integration and like realization that other people are not the enemy.
Hmm.
So, despite the fact that there were thousands of these centers in the United States, there's been very little research outside of what we've talked about so far about these community canning centers, and specifically their role in African American communities or in terms of women empowerment, which we haven't talked about to this point. But many of these canneries ended up being run basically by entirely female staff, which I think is really interesting, again, considering the context of when and where this was, and then that more collective role in the community, that this was a really unique opportunity for marginalized people to kind of claim their stake in society and be empowered. That's, you know, something that's worth exploring more. And I hope maybe some folks listening to this that need a research topic decide that this is one worth doing. So basically, what I'm saying is that this allowed a lot of women the opportunity to subvert a lot of those narratives about like women being like on the margins and claim some power and leadership within a community that otherwise wouldn't have given it to them.
Yeah, seriously. Speaking of research projects, we just read a great one recently about the guerrilla gardening. Do you remember who wrote that?
I don't, but yes, speaking of which, someone named Isabella Parenti mentioned us in her research paper called Seeds of Resistance, examining guerrilla gardening as a method of anti-capitalism and neoliberal defiance. So that's cool.
And it's really good. So check that out.
And Matt says it's really good. So that's pretty cool. I read some of it. I'm not going to lie. I didn't finish
You
it.
read the post that said the Pork Bros Almanac.
I read like 3 pages of it and then I got distracted by something. Sorry. But no, it seemed very interesting. Highly recommend going to read it. See what they say about us, that we are revolutionizing the food system in America and globally even. I'm sure they said that, right, Matt?
Yep, that's what they said.
Okay, good. Just confirming what I already knew.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So, let's get back into this whole canning thing, because we've been kind of like dancing around this idea of like community canning centers as being more than just canning. But as the Great Depression wore on, it was significantly like this is how people survived. Like the victory gardens, as we're going to talk about, weren't what people think they were now. And the community canning centers were particularly important for the people that did grow them. So as World War II ramped up and people realized like they needed to grow food and be in community and process food, African Americans who had historically been marginalized and used to being food insecure were better prepared for that environment. And as the government pushed for these victory gardens to help supplement agriculture in the United States, as we were shipping stuff overseas to our allies, as we were using corn for ethanol, as we were doing all these things, as we were retooling facilities to make weapons, the government was like, everyone needs to grow food. It's important. We're going to do propaganda, right? Everyone's seen those posters. But a lot of middle-class white folks just didn't care. But the government tried really hard. I'll give them that.
I was going to say they did go pretty hard with Dig for Victory.
Yeah, they went real hard on some of it. You wouldn't be surprised if you read the pamphlets from the canning centers, because they honestly sound pretty radical by like government standards for, you know, education propaganda. So like the 1946 USDA Community Canning Center pamphlet reads like this: community canning centers will not just happen. They must be planned and arranged for well in advance of the season in which they are needed. Planning soundly and getting the center operating on a business basis from the beginning are necessary if the center is to be successful over a period that justifies the expenditure of money and effort involved. Successful canning centers usually are the result of group action spurred on by some individual who sees the need for providing facilities for preserving food and has the energy to do something about it. It doesn't matter who this is, an energetic homemaker, a home demonstration agent, a businessman growing his first garden, a teacher of vocational agriculture or home economics, or a civic leader. They're basically like, you be the change in the world that you wish to see. Grow food, support your community, support your country.
Grow food and put it in a jar.
Put it in a jar.
It's their call to action.
Yeah, and they made canning seem like a patriotic duty for women. It was the way of like reducing waste so that you didn't have to grow as much food or it could be sent to soldiers overseas. Now, doing this allowed women to kind of step into the role of like overseeing food production, right? And this allowed a lot of women to access a platform and exert influence, and allowed them to also start building some community solidarity and challenge some of the existing power structures related to food production. And it allowed women to advocate for themselves collectively on things that were important to women at the time during World War II. So like a big one was like sugar rationing. That was a really big hot button topic. You know, women needed sugar for canning fruits and things like that, but it was really limited for individuals. However, businesses that sold sweets could get as much as they wanted. So a lot of the women that led these centers started organizing and protesting and going to the press and saying, like, if you want us to do these things, you need to give us access to the materials to do it. And they were able to leverage kind of that pulpit that they had created to shift some of this narrative around, like, how do we do these things and how are we going to support, you know, the war efforts?
The war efforts, Andy.
The war efforts.
We got to keep them going. The efforts.
Now, despite the discussions of this massive increase in canning centers, I know this is going to be surprising to many of our listeners. Only 1% of white women who canned in 1943 did so in a community canning center. Many women, particularly in urban and suburban communities, said that they had no time, they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have food to even can in the first place. That canning in white communities was predominantly for upper middle class white women and poor rural white women. That feels eerily similar to the modern homesteader movement, which is driven by either absolute need that, like, if I don't grow this food, I will be hungry, or women who have too much money and resources who want to be influencers.
Yeah, I mean, history will repeat itself. Just a new round of influencers.
A new brand of influencers is right. Now, African American women comparatively were overwhelmingly drawn to community canning centers, and this even in places where it was considered riskier to claim space as Black women in the pre-civil rights era, so going to integrated canning centers and so on. One booklet, for example, described African American women in Detroit who, in their words, courageously, which I'm not disagreeing with at all, I just wanted to put that in quotes, attended a canning demonstration during a race riot and were unable to return home for 3 days. Like, I hope those fucking pickles are popping if it took you 3 days to get home for that fucking canning, right?
Get home and the can didn't seal.
Oh, these are mid as shit.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be real pissed. No, but like it speaks to, like, again, the way class and race dynamics at this time reinforced how the war efforts were really placed on the shoulders of poor communities, primarily African American poor communities. And this, like I said, was very clear in the way victory gardens were grown. You know, for most upper middle class or upper class white Americans, if they had a garden, it was managed by an African American man who was taking care of it and making sure the plants produced food, right? And then many of them went home and managed their own gardens. So, for example, in Dallas, 90% of African American families had gardens in comparison to 40% of their white neighbors. Those are pretty bad margins, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty significant jump.
Yeah. So it's no surprise then, seeing the difference in how much food was being grown at home, that something like canning, and specifically community canning, because you're doing it at that scale, was much more central in African American communities than in white ones. For context, in 1943, more than 4.1 billion jars of food were produced in homes and community canning centers, making up supposedly 40% of the vegetables consumed in the nation. Or at least that's what was reported. However, government's private correspondence suggests otherwise. For example, a study in Maine noted that although 93% of families in Waldo County, not that this county matters, it's just the one study I can point to, had gardens, of the 93%, 18% were considered poor, and another 39 were considered only fair.
Sounds right for Waldo County.
Fuck Waldo County. You heard it here first. So, like, the point I'm trying to make is that these victory gardens disproportionately placed the labor of producing food on poor people to keep them from starving, while middle-class Americans that felt bad about the war efforts or the fact that they were in war kind of just like felt like, I grew a tomato, I'm helping, like the Ralph Wiggum meme. Because in reality, again, poor people were facing the brunt of the war shortages. While the immediate post-war period witnessed a decline in community canneries, they continued to persist in various forms, reflecting the evolving needs and priorities of communities while continuing to provide essential services. Community canneries, particularly those that survived into the later 20th and early 21st centuries, continued to adapt to changing community needs and have gone beyond just being canning centers from a functional standpoint to also training on general food safety, nutrition, and even like entrepreneurial ventures. So basic like business education, providing kitchens to like trial commercial goods. So if you want to learn, can your grandmother's hot sauce and sell it, it provided a space to do that. And this allowed these centers to kind of continue to exist in kind of a modern context. So these spaces have now become these kind of like multi-use spaces. And, we've talked a lot about like different potential crops in this country, right? So like we've talked about sunchokes and ground nuts and persimmons and pawpaws, and as people are growing them and thinking about how to use them, these are the types of places where you could start to figure out, if I want to integrate this into the diet of the world around me, how can I start to figure out what that looks like? Developing these niche products, thinking about basic business education on, if I even do create a good product, what do I do then? Like, how do I even start a business? What do I have to do? How do I make sure I don't lose everything I own? All those important things.
Just little things.
Yeah, little things.
Just small.
That we can start to like retool these resources to think about what local food looks like. And a really interesting example is one of these centers in Minnesota, which pairs a cannery with community gardens.
That go together, like Minnesota and
Snow, giant
and
mosquitoes,
snow. And lakes.
Lakes. Yeah, goes together like Minnesota and lakes. I think there's like a lot of talk about like tool libraries as these like radical spaces to be like, it doesn't have to just be books. We can do these tool libraries. We can think about how we can collectivize common shared resources. But like community canning centers in the modern world could be these quasi business centers. They could be, instead of tool libraries, like food libraries, homesteading libraries. So like, why do anyone that has a dozen chickens for raising meat need to have its own chicken plucker, right? Like,
yeah, it's a great example.
They're huge, expensive pieces of equipment that you use twice a year, but a community could use it hundreds of times a year if we timed it correctly. So those are the things that we could be starting to think about. How can we be smarter about these things? How can we be more useful and not wasteful about buying and utilizing things before they turn into waste again?
Specifically with like gardens or vegetable farms, there's so much waste in between the planting and like getting it to the end consumer fresh. And that like, more and more small vegetable farms are integrating some form of, just speaking anecdotally, not statistically, but integrating some form of added value processing onto their farm. And there's a huge amount of investment, like USDA money, available for adding that sort of infrastructure to farms and gardens.
Yeah, like I think it's an interesting concept, but I think it's kind of diversification for the sake of diversification, which like diversification isn't a bad thing, but instead we should be thinking about instead of me having vegetable crops, and then goats that I feed the waste to, and then a small canning processing line or something, and then a small fruit orchard with a cidery attached to it. Instead, we should be thinking about, to the point of the community canning center, how do I scale this to the point where each profit center is its own business that stand on its own feet? And that probably looks like different businesses run by different people, because that's a full-time job where you can specialize in the thing you do, but you can share these other resources the way a cooperative organizes. But instead, like, if 10 farmers that grew different things owned their own grocery store, right? Like a very limited grocery store in this theoretical example. But that's the way you would think about, like, something like, to the beginning of this conversation, how do you scale up to the point where you're getting the full benefits of scalability before you lose that autonomy? And I think a lot of small farmers are kind of doing the opposite. They're diversifying, but they're not scaling up to get those benefits of that diversity, right? Where, yes, you're saving energy in the sense of, well, this celery was bad, so I fed it to a goat, which I can sell its milk. That's great. I'm glad you're doing that. But if you haven't already scaled to a capacity where it's sufficient, that doesn't really matter. You're just borrowing from Peter to pay Paul in a lot of ways. And that's where we can start thinking about our food systems differently with centers like this that can optimize, operate, and organize, wow, the big three O's, and be a functional way for our community to rethink how we do things.
Amen, brother.
Amen, brother. Anyways, I feel like I've talked to Chris Newman about this. So if your ears perk up at this very niche business talk, go check out our interview with Sylvan Aqua Farms. Also, if you are interested in business stuff and you're like, I want to learn more about how businesses work, why they work the way they do, I do have a small project called Common Sense. You can find it on Instagram at Common Sense Inc. We do monthly trainings on business education, mostly on the finance side of things, accounting side of things, tax side of things. So if you're interested in that, I love talking about this shit. So come join us over there.
He does.
We do it every month.
We really can't stop him.
It's free to join, but if you feel like you want to catch up on all the old content, it is just a small fee to see all the old stuff, but the new stuff is always free. But to get back to what we are talking about, canning, lots of fun. Go do it. Maybe do it with some homies. Maybe build a cannery.
Maybe do it with your community.
Maybe add some chicken processing to it. Maybe a cow or two.
Check out the under 10,000 birds a year exemptions.
There you go. Maybe get some buddies together and do some hunting training, cooperative and community canning of venison and all that cool stuff. There's ideas. I've talked about the idea of like what would be a really good example of like one of these community centers is maple syrup processing.
Yeah.
That one seems like the most like suburban maple syrup processing. If you're in the Northeast, there are maple trees everywhere. You don't have to just tap sugar maples. You can tap red maples, other maples.
Hell, you can tap a hickory if you want.
You can tap a hickory.
Don't let them say you can't tap a hickory.
You don't want to get your syrups mixed up though. You can tap birch. I actually have some videos from way back when we started this podcast on Instagram from me tapping birch trees. But maples are pretty ubiquitous on the landscape. So that seems like a no-brainer for like, how do you build community solidarity and resiliency? You get the super high profit margin crop and you buy equipment that is scaled to be super efficient. Like that is the win-win. And then you give people, hey, you have a house with a red maple tree. Do you mind if I come here and tap it and I'll come and collect the sap every day for a week? Cool. I'll give you a jar of maple syrup after, and it's from your front yard. How fucking cool is that? Like that should not be a hard sell. So if anyone does that, please let me know. I will hype the shit out of your products because I think it'd be really cool and I just don't have time to do it.
Yes.
Matt won't hype your product though. He's like, fuck that.
No, I'll hype it. I just need a little buy-in. I need a little taste of the syrup.
Like a jar or two of
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you guys found this content interesting, go check out the Substack. It is up there with all the sources. But I am serious. There does need to be more research done in this area in terms of like its historical value. So go check out your local archives if you know there's a cannery near you. Find out if there was one. Figure out what you can. There's a lot of history to be uncovered that I think is going to be really exciting when somebody gets into it. I'm excited to find out. If you find out any cool stuff, please reach out. I want to know as much as I can about this. It's really cool. And that's it. That's all I got.
And Andy, can you give us those 3 O's one more time?
I cannot.
Oh, okay.
I do not remember. Do you?
No.
Okay.
Go back 30 seconds.
Thanks. They're really inspiring there, Matt.
Fuck.
Also, lastly, if you are annoyed with the commercials, I get it. We are using the money from the commercials to fund some really cool research. But if you don't want to deal with the commercials, you can always subscribe on patreon.com for $2 a month and get that content early and ad-free. I hate to sell stuff because it sucks and it's stupid, but we do live in a world where that is required. This content does take us a long time to put together. We love you all. We love the content, but it is a lot of effort. So, go do your thing. If you want to support us, we appreciate it. If you can't, that's fine. Just letting you know it's out there. All that fun stuff. Matt, any last words? Did I miss anything?
You didn't miss a goddamn thing. Episode done.
10 for 10. I'm like Jordan in his prime.